The night begins quietly, as all strange stories should. Imagine yourself somewhere safe, perhaps your bed, perhaps just a quiet corner of thought, while outside, the world hums with distant rain. Tonight, we drift into a chapter of history wrapped not in blood or thunder, but in candlelight and fear. This is not the story of soldiers and battles, not at first, but of the thoughts that move behind the curtain, the strange and secret dreams that grow in the dark, when reason sleeps. Picture a vast stone castle somewhere in Europe, its windows black against the storm. The year might be 1938, or 1939, the air carries the weight of war that hasn't yet arrived but already feels inevitable. Deep within that fortress, behind thick oak doors and echoing corridors, a group of men gathers around a long wooden table. Their uniforms glimmer with black polish, their boots tap softly against the floor. The room smells of wax, iron, and damp stone. Above them, the walls are lined with ancient maps, of continents, of constellations, of half-forgotten empires. At the center of the table lies a candle, its flame trembling each time one of them breathes. These men, the officers of an empire that has not yet reached its height, are not meeting to discuss battle plans. They are whispering about symbols, about runes carved into old stones, about relics buried in mountain snow, about races of gods that might have once walked among men. They speak with the kind of fascination that borders on worship. To them, history is not a story of cause and effect, but of destiny and energy, of invisible forces that guide nations and decide the fate of peoples. Outside, lightning flashes briefly against the sky, lighting their faces with white fire before darkness folds back over them like a cloak. It is easy, from the safety of the present, to think of them as monsters. And they were, in ways history cannot excuse. But in this first quiet hour, before the atrocities, before the ruins, what we see in that candlelight is not yet cruelty, it is belief. Misguided, dangerous, yes, but belief nonetheless. A longing to belong to something greater than the ordinary, to stand at the edge of mystery and claim that it means something. Perhaps that is why stories like these still hold us captive, because they remind us how thin the line is between wonder and destruction. The sound of thunder rolls over the hills. Somewhere in the castle, a door shuts slowly. The candle flickers, and for a moment the runes drawn across the map seem to move, as if alive. One man leans forward and speaks in a low, measured voice. He says that history itself is a code, that the rise and fall of civilizations can be predicted through the study of ancient patterns. Another man, younger, his eyes bright and uncertain, takes notes. He sketches strange shapes in the margins of his notebook, swastikas, serpents, stars. The air grows heavy with expectation. They believe they are touching the edge of something cosmic. And yet, beneath the ceremony of their words, there lingers something hollow, a kind of fear that perhaps the modern world, with its machines and noise, has lost whatever meaning once bound men to the earth and the stars. They speak of purity and destiny because they no longer feel the ground beneath them. They light candles not only for ritual, but because the darkness beyond is too vast to face without them. In that way, their obsession with symbols and ancient power is not so different from any human search for order in chaos. The danger lies only in what they are willing to do to preserve that illusion. Outside, the rain turns to a slow, cold drizzle. The castle walls seem to breathe. Down the corridor, a sentry pauses, hearing the murmur of voices behind the door. He cannot make out the words, but something in the tone, part reverence, part command, sends a shiver down his spine. He adjusts his cap, glances once more at the lightning over the horizon, and resumes his watch. He does not know that these whispers, small and strange as they sound now, will one day grow into something that will shake the world. The candle on the table burns low. One of the men rises and carries a document to the center. It is a proposal, though not of war, at least not yet. It speaks of research, of expeditions to distant lands. Of uncovering lost truths about humanity's origins. Of proving, through ancient signs and mystical science, that their nation is chosen by fate itself. The others nod, solemnly. A stamp is pressed into red wax. The idea becomes policy. A myth becomes an order. We are so used to thinking of history as movement, armies advancing, empires collapsing, that we forget how quietly it begins. Not with a shout, but with a whisper. Not on the battlefield, but in the mind. The stories men tell themselves, in rooms like this one, decide more than bullets ever will. And so, in this quiet chamber of flickering light, a new world is being imagined. A world where the mystical and the political blend into one, a world where symbols are stronger than truth. The thunder fades. The officers rise from the table, gathering their papers. Their boots echo through the hall, fading into the distance. The candle burns itself to nothing, and the room sinks into darkness once more. Outside, the flags on the towers whip against the rain. Somewhere in the distance, the faint sound of a train whistles through the night, carrying soldiers and supplies toward a future that none of them can yet imagine. It would be comforting to think that all of this, the rituals, the superstition, the talk of destiny, was just madness. But human history rarely divides so neatly between madness and meaning. The truth is more uncomfortable. The men who once plotted by candlelight believed they were restoring order to a chaotic world. They saw themselves not as villains, but as seekers. Seekers of hidden wisdom, of forgotten truths, of a purity that existed only in dreams. And that, perhaps, is what makes this story so unsettling. The realization that evil does not always begin with hatred. Sometimes, it begins with fascination. As you listen, the firelight of that long-ago room fades in your mind. The thunder becomes softer, turning into the rhythm of your own breathing. What remains is only the echo, the gentle, haunting sound of people trying to grasp eternity with trembling hands. History, in the end, is full of such whispers. Some fade harmlessly into time. Others, like this one, grow louder until they drown out everything else. So tonight, as you drift towards sleep, imagine that flicker of light once more. The candle, the maps, the shadows leaning close. Feel how thin the air was, how heavy with secrets. And remember, every great darkness in history began as a single quiet moment when someone mistook mystery for truth. The rest, the armies, the ruins, the broken cities, came later. But here, in the hush of that first whisper, the story began. The story of every empire's collapse begins not with the moment it falls, but with the silence that follows. Germany, in the winter of 1918, was such a silence. The guns had gone quiet along the Western Front. The trenches, once full of noise and smoke, lay open to the rain. Men stumbled home through fields that no longer had names, carrying neither victory nor purpose, only a thin hunger and a memory of fire. The empire that had promised greatness dissolved overnight into uncertainty. What remained was a people adrift, humiliated, starving, and spiritually hollow. Cities that once glittered with promise were now wrapped in fog and despair. Berlin's grand boulevards had become rivers of weary faces. Coal was scarce, bread was scarcer. Children played beside walls scarred by shrapnel, while their parents traded heirlooms for potatoes at black market stalls. Veterans, too young to be called old, wandered the streets with empty sleeves or hollow eyes, their medals hidden beneath worn coats. The war had ended, but no one could find peace in its absence. The Treaty of Versailles arrived like a curse written on paper. Its signatures carried the weight of collective shame. Overnight, Germany became a defeated nation forced to kneel before its victors. The old monarchy had vanished, the Kaiser fled, and the new republic that replaced it, fragile and uncertain, struggled to hold the pieces together. Factories lay still. Inflation devoured savings faster than people could earn them. A loaf of bread could cost a wheelbarrow of notes. In this chaos, reason began to feel useless, like a fragile bridge over a river already swallowed by floodwaters. And when reason falters, other voices rise. In smoky taverns and candlelit back rooms, people began to whisper about hidden causes. The world, they said, had not collapsed by accident. Perhaps dark powers had conspired against Germany. Perhaps destiny itself had turned its back. Some turned to politics, shouting about democracy or revolution. Others turned inward, to mysticism, to ancient symbols, to half-remembered legends of purity and fate. They sought not just answers, but meaning. Something larger than the humiliation of daily life. When the old gods are silent, one man wrote in a pamphlet passed hand to hand, new prophets speak. And speak they did. Preachers of destiny, astrologers of empire, mystics promising rebirth. They filled the void left by toppled thrones and broken faith. Among them, in the city of Munich, a small circle gathered around a candlelit table. Their name was the Thule Society. They believed that the blood of ancient Aryan gods still flowed through chosen veins, and that Germany's downfall was not the end, but the beginning of a new age. At first, they were only a handful of dreamers, artists, writers, soldiers with too much memory and too little peace. They spoke of Atlantis, of lost northern lands, of runes carved into the bones of time. They blended nationalist pride with pagan myth, draping the wounds of the present in the language of eternity. They wore amulets shaped like suns, studied Nordic sagas, and saw in every ancient stone the reflection of their future. It was a strange comfort, this mythic nationalism, a story that promised that suffering had purpose. Outside their meetings, the world continued its quiet unraveling. People queued in endless lines for bread that never came. The winter wind slipped through the cracks of houses once proud and warm. In the churches, pews stood half empty, not out of disbelief, but fatigue. God, too, seemed defeated. In such a world, it was easy for new faiths to grow, faiths not of compassion, but of destiny. The Thule Society's ideas were not born in isolation. Dozens of similar groups appeared across Germany, circles of mystics, racial theorists, and self-proclaimed scholars of the supernatural. Some studied the stars, others the ruins of ancient Europe. They claimed to uncover the secret origins of humanity, tracing German bloodlines back to gods and heroes. Their writings mixed astrology with archaeology, myth with science, poetry with politics. It was all nonsense, and yet, it had rhythm. It sounded like hope to those who had lost everything else. Among the members of these societies were men who would later shape history. They came not as conquerors, but as listeners, absorbing every tale of secret heritage, every myth of chosen races, every promise that Germany would rise again under cosmic favor. In the haze of cigar smoke and whispered prophecy, the foundation stones of a new ideology were quietly being laid. It is easy to dismiss such gatherings as foolish superstition, but one must understand their setting. When a nation's body is broken, its soul searches for form. And when truth feels powerless, myth offers certainty. In the flicker of candlelight, surrounded by old books and symbols, people began to believe that destiny could be summoned, that the ancient world still breathed beneath their feet, waiting to be awakened. In that dim post-war decade, the line between politics and mysticism blurred. Newspapers printed horoscopes alongside speeches. Military veterans attended seances. Even educated men began to speak of energies, races, and cycles of civilization. A hunger for belonging filled the air. People needed to believe that Germany's suffering was not meaningless, that some grand cosmic force had chosen them for renewal. And so, while politicians argued in daylight over democracy and treaties, the nights belonged to another kind of vision. Men gathered under the symbols of runes, candles flickering over swastikas long before the world would know their meaning. They read aloud from occult texts and Nordic legends, reciting words that made them feel ancient and eternal. They believed that if they could recover the wisdom of the past, they could command the future. The myth grew like ivy, slow, beautiful, and suffocating. It wrapped itself around every wounded heart and whispered promises of greatness. It told people that they had not failed, the world had simply forgotten its true order. It told them that through will and faith, they could awaken the divine spark within their blood. That through discipline, purity, and devotion, they would build a new empire on the bones of the old. By the time the 1920s turned into the 1930s, that language of destiny had spread far beyond secret circles. It had found a new stage, a political one. The whispers had become speeches. The candles had become torches. The longing for mystical rebirth had found its messiah in a man who spoke not in runes but in rage. And yet, beneath the roar of his rallies and the banners of his empire, the same dream pulsed quietly, the dream born in the shadows of defeat, when men mistook myth for truth. Germany, once the heart of philosophy and science, had become a nation haunted by its own imagination. And though the streets would soon fill again with marching boots and thunderous slogans, the roots of that darkness had already sunk deep into the soil, planted here, in the quiet despair after the fall of empires, where hunger and humiliation taught people to believe that destiny, not mercy, would save them. As night settles over this part of our story, imagine those silent streets again, the flickering lamps, the weary faces, the sound of distant trains carrying veterans home to nothing. Somewhere, in an attic or cellar, another candle burns, and another small group gathers to talk of symbols, stars, and secret worlds. They think they are only dreaming. But history, always listening, begins to take note. In every age, there are symbols that seem to outlive the people who use them. They drift through centuries like silent travelers, changing shape, meaning, and color with each new hand that claims them. One of these ancient wanderers was a sign as simple as it was profound, a hooked cross, for arms bent at right angles, turning endlessly upon itself. It had once been a prayer, a charm, a sun, a wheel of life. For thousands of years, it had graced temples, pottery, and cloth from India to Iceland. It was called by many names: swastika, sun cross, wheel of fortune. It belonged to no single race, no single creed. It was, in its beginning, a wish for light. Long before the 20th century, this symbol had been carved into stones across the ancient world. It spun across Buddhist shrines in the Himalayas, adorned the shields of Greek warriors, and appeared in the mosaics of early Europe. In Sanskrit, svastika meant to be well. It was a prayer for blessing, a small turning of the world toward good fortune. The same shape appeared among the Navajo, the Celts, the Vikings. Everywhere, it carried warmth, the echo of the sun's eternal return after the long night. But by the dawn of the 20th century, this innocent sign began to drift toward a different meaning. In the aftermath of World War I, Germany was not looking for luck, it was looking for identity. The mystics of the Thule Society, the dreamers of racial destiny, began to search through ancient symbols for something that could stand as a banner of rebirth. Among the runes and relics, one sign captured their imagination more than any other: the swastika. They said it was older than all other emblems, the mark of an ancient Aryan people whose wisdom had shaped the world. In their hands, what had once meant life began to mean blood. Picture a table in a dim Munich office, around the year 1919. On it lies a small red flag, its fabric rough but clean. A man bends over it, sketching lines with a trembling pencil. He draws a black cross, then curves its arms, turning them like blades in motion. Around it, he draws a white circle, pure and empty like a sun eclipsed. And behind it, a field of red, vivid, defiant, the color of sacrifice and power. When he steps back, he does not see an ancient symbol of peace. He sees a promise, a weapon of the spirit. The man's name is Adolf Hitler, and this design, simple and symmetrical, will soon travel the world as the emblem of a new faith, a faith born from ruin. To those who followed him, the symbol was hypnotic. It seemed to vibrate with purpose, to spin with unseen energy. The black shape against the white and red struck a chord in the hearts of a defeated people. It looked ancient, inevitable, like a mark carved by history itself. On banners and armbands, on coins and official seals, it appeared everywhere at once. Children painted it in classrooms, soldiers stitched it to their sleeves. The old imperial eagle was forgotten. The hooked cross had taken flight. In its earliest uses, the swastika carried meanings of cosmic harmony. Its four arms represented the turning of seasons, the balance of elements, the eternal return of light. To Buddhists, it meant eternity and compassion. To ancient Europeans, it meant fertility and good harvests. But symbols are mirrors, they reflect the soul of whoever holds them. In Nazi hands, it became a mirror of rage and longing. Its spinning motion was reimagined not as a cycle of life, but as a wheel of conquest. Its lines, once smooth with grace, were sharpened into edges. The same form that had once invited blessing now demanded obedience. It is strange, how easily beauty can be bent. The Nazis understood that symbols do not merely decorate power, they create it. A nation is not bound together by logic, but by feeling. They used architecture, music, ceremony, and insignia to replace faith with ritual, science with myth, thought with emotion. Every banner hung in a city square was not just decoration, but invocation. Each red flag was a prayer to destiny. And the swastika, placed at the center of all these rituals, became more than a sign, it became an atmosphere. In vast stadiums, thousands of them fluttered in unison like mechanical wings. In candlelit halls, SS officers wore them as talismans of sacred duty. The symbol carried weight beyond politics. It promised to reconnect modern man with something ancient and absolute. It told him that the machine age, the factories, and the smog, were not the end of civilization but the beginning of a new myth. Yet beneath this spectacle, a quiet tragedy unfolded. The old meanings of the symbol, its warmth, its humanity, were buried beneath layers of ideology. It no longer pointed to the sun, it pointed to supremacy. It no longer turned with the seasons, it turned with hatred. By claiming to resurrect the ancient world, the Nazis destroyed its essence. The swastika, once a bridge between cultures, became a wall dividing them. Still, one must understand why it worked. In a country that felt lost and humiliated, the symbol gave shape to invisible desires. It spoke to both the heart and the imagination. It told a broken people that they were chosen, that their history stretched beyond the war, beyond modernity, into the sacred past. It offered, in its simple geometry, a sense of order and purpose that reason alone could not provide. That is how myth always begins, as a comfort in the face of chaos. As the 1930s unfolded, the swastika became inescapable. It adorned uniforms, medals, churches, even teacups. The more it appeared, the less it seemed like a symbol and the more it felt like a presence, a sun that never set, even in the darkest hours. To those outside Germany, it was menacing, to those within, it was mesmerizing. It promised strength, unity, destiny. People did not simply see it, they believed in it. And perhaps that is the cruelest truth of all, the most powerful symbols are not invented. They are inherited, then misused. They survive by changing shape until no one remembers what they once meant. The same lines that once blessed temples now marked concentration camps. The same sun that had promised life now burned cities to ash. But if we look beyond the horror, we can still glimpse the deeper lesson, the warning written within the shape itself. A symbol is only as pure as the soul that wields it. When beauty is stripped of compassion, when meaning becomes a weapon, even light can turn to shadow. The swastika's journey from a sacred charm to a sign of destruction is not just a story of one nation's fall, it is a reminder of how easily truth can be twisted by need, by pride, by longing for something greater than the self. And so, in our story, the symbol turns once more, not on banners or in the air, but in memory. It spins quietly in the dark, stripped of its power, returned to the stillness of history. Perhaps, in some distant time, it will again find its way toward peace. But here, in the restless night of the 1930s, its light has been stolen. The hooked cross gleams from the walls of rallies, from medals and armbands, from the hearts of men who believe they are touching eternity. They do not yet see that they have set eternity aflame. In the years when Germany's banners began to spread across Europe, one man among the new rulers looked not to the future, but to the past. His name was Heinrich Himmler, and while others built armies, he built a mythology. To him, the war was not merely a struggle for land or power. It was a sacred undertaking, a kind of spiritual resurrection. He believed that the destiny of his nation was written not in treaties or weapons, but in the forgotten pages of ancient legend. When most men saw the world in maps and borders, Himmler saw it in symbols and circles. He imagined the SS, his elite corps, not as mere soldiers, but as knights of a mystical order, heirs to a hidden lineage stretching back to the Teutonic Knights, the Druids, and even the gods themselves. They would not simply fight for Germany, they would embody its soul. To shape them, he needed not just discipline, but ritual. Not just training, but faith. It began, as so many dreams do, with a building. In a small Westphalian town called Wilsberg, Himmler discovered a triangular Renaissance castle perched upon a hill. It was old, isolated, and hauntingly beautiful, a place with walls thick enough to hold secrets. Standing there one overcast morning, the wind heavy with the scent of pine and rain, he decided that this would be the spiritual heart of his new order. Wilsberg would be remade as the center of the world. Architects and scholars were summoned. The castle's old stones were polished, its towers repaired. But this was no ordinary restoration. Every chamber was redesigned with symbolism in mind. Circles replaced corners. Geometric precision replaced ornament. The castle was to become a temple of destiny, a shrine to the myth of the Aryan past. Beneath its northern tower, builders carved out a crypt with 12 stone pillars and a dark domed ceiling. Here, Himmler envisioned gatherings of his 12 most trusted officers, seated in candlelight, each representing one of the mythic knights of old. Above them, in the marble-floored hall, the black sun was inlaid, a vast mosaic of 12 radiating arms, its design echoing both runic patterns and cosmic geometry. No one could say exactly what it meant. Some called it a symbol of power, others, a wheel of eternity. To Himmler, it was a compass pointing inward, toward the soul of the Germanic race. Those who visited the castle spoke of an atmosphere unlike any other. It was not frightening, but heavy, as though the walls themselves remembered something ancient. Candles burned at all hours, their smoke curling against the stones. Maps of lost continents, Atlantis, Hyperborea, hung beside military charts. Shelves overflowed with books on runes, folklore, and medieval law. In the silence, the air seemed to hum with unseen energy. The men chosen to serve in Himmler's inner circles were not allowed to think of themselves as ordinary officers. They were to be the new aristocracy of the world to come, guardians of blood, purity, and myth. They studied genealogies instead of tactics. They were instructed to trace their ancestry back centuries, to prove their descent from ancient northern tribes. Marriage required approval, children were baptized not by priests but in ceremonies that invoked sun and soil. Even their rings were engraved with runes, gifts from Himmler himself, to be returned upon death, as if to preserve the sanctity of their oath. Each detail was carefully constructed to blur the line between history and ritual, between loyalty and worship. Their uniforms, with their silver sig runes and skull insignia, were designed to evoke medieval heraldry. The salute was not just a gesture of obedience, but a kind of invocation. In Himmler's imagination, the SS would become a church, its creed, racial mysticism, its scripture, pseudo-history, its God, the dream of eternal order. For Himmler, ritual was not mere pageantry. It was control. He believed that by surrounding his officers with sacred symbols and repeated ceremonies, he could bind them more deeply than any ideology or law. Each oath, each candle, each rune carved into a wall served as a thread in a vast psychological web. The men who entered Wilsberg came out not only loyal, but transformed. They carried themselves as if chosen, as if every heartbeat echoed through time. Sometimes, late at night, when the castle slept, Himmler would walk its halls alone. He would pause before the black sun, his boots clicking softly against the floor, and stare into its spiraling arms. To him, it was a map of destiny, a vision of a world reborn through struggle, guided by ancient forces. He saw himself not as a servant of Hitler, but as the high priest of a new civilization. Yet even in this quiet grandeur, there was an unease that could not be erased. The deeper he descended into the myths he created, the further he drifted from reality. Scholars he employed to justify his beliefs, archaeologists, linguists, historians, found themselves pressured to twist evidence to fit prophecy. Those who hesitated disappeared. Truth became irrelevant, what mattered was faith. In Wheelsburg's dining halls, officers toasted not only their Führer but their ancestors, invoking Odin and the old gods. They recited oaths before fire, believing they were binding themselves to eternal destiny. The flicker of torchlight on the stone walls made their shadows dance like spirits. What had begun as ritual became worship, worship of race, of myth, of the illusion of purity. There is something both magnificent and tragic in it. The castle, with its solemn symmetry and candlelit grandeur, might have been a sanctuary of learning in another age, a place where monks copied wisdom, or where artists painted the stars. Instead, it became a mirror for human delusion. The men within its walls believed they were awakening something divine, they were only deepening their own darkness. Outside, the world was changing faster than they knew. Cities were being rebuilt, armies prepared, speeches shouted across the radio. The SS grew from a small circle into a machine of terror. Yet Himmler remained drawn to his castle, returning often to oversee rituals, study genealogies, or simply to stand beneath the crypt's domed ceiling, listening to the echo of his own footsteps. The myths that had once comforted him now demanded proof, and proof, in his hands, became violence. He could no longer tell where imagination ended and reality began. In his mind, every act of war became a sacred rite, every conquest a step toward restoring the lost harmony of the ancient world. Under his guidance, the SS stopped being a military unit and became a cult, its members trained not only to obey, but to believe. And so, as thunder rolled once again across Germany's skies, Wheelsburg stood silent and watchful on its hill, the candles still burning in its lower halls. The rituals continued. The black sun gleamed underfoot. And the world, without knowing it, moved closer to a nightmare born not from hatred alone, but from the seduction of meaning, the belief that darkness could be made holy. Outside the castle walls, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying the faint smell of rain. The night deepened, and somewhere far away, the machinery of war began to turn. But here, within these ancient stones, Himmler's dream lived on, a dream that promised power through purity, eternity through blood. A dream that began, like all terrible dreams do, with beauty, order, and the quiet certainty that one was serving something greater than oneself. Night had a different weight inside the walls of Wheelsburg. The wind outside seemed to fade at its edge, as if afraid to enter. Within those old stones, the silence was not empty, it was full, thick with the hum of memory and ritual. Candles burned in alcoves, their light soft and golden against the black uniforms of men who walked the corridors with reverent precision. Every footstep, every whisper, seemed to belong to something larger than the moment, as though the castle itself were listening. Wheelsburg had become more than a fortress, it was a cathedral for a new faith. Its design spoke of symmetry and mystery, every hall aligned to hidden meaning. Above, the stars turned slowly through the windows of the tower, below, in the crypt, 12 pillars held the ceiling like the ribs of a sleeping giant. Between them, in a circle of shadow, lay a stone table, the so-called Hall of the Dead, where Himmler's chosen few imagined they communed with the spirits of the ancestors. They called it the Valhalla of the SS. On certain nights, when the moon was high and the air outside lay silver on the fields, torches flickered along the stairways as the officers descended into that chamber. They came in silence, each carrying a small flame. At the center of the room, beneath the dark dome, they placed their candles upon the table, forming a ring of trembling light. Then the doors closed, sealing them in. What happened in those gatherings was never written in official records. Some said prayers were whispered, others, that oaths were renewed. But all agreed that the atmosphere was heavy, too heavy, as though centuries pressed down upon the air. They spoke of purity, destiny, and blood. They invoked the ancestors, not as memory, but as living presence. For them, the dead were not gone, they were watching, guiding, demanding. The flicker of each candle was a heartbeat linking past to present, soldier to spirit. It was a ritual that blurred the line between faith and fear. For to serve in this brotherhood was to surrender not only one's life, but one's soul. The young officers who entered the castle for initiation came trembling with awe. They had heard stories of Weilsburg, how it was the spiritual heart of the SS, how Himmler himself walked its halls like a priest. They imagined grandeur, glory, revelation. Instead, they found quiet and shadow. The ceremony began with silence. They stood before the black sun mosaic, its 12 arms spreading outward beneath their feet like a frozen wheel. The candles flickered, and the shadows of the men seemed to merge, becoming one shape, one breath. A voice, calm, deliberate, commanding, asked them to pledge their lives not to Germany, not even to the Führer, but to the order itself, to the eternal chain of blood and will. One by one, they spoke their vows. Their voices, echoing softly against stone, sounded less like words than like the murmuring of ghosts. Afterward, they were given rings, silver, engraved with runes and skulls, symbols of death and eternity. Return them upon your death, they were told. For the order does not die. The ring was both ornament and chain, a reminder that individuality had ended. From that moment onward, their lives belonged to the myth they served. The castle became a living ritual. Every room, every corridor had its meaning. In the dining hall, feasts were held not merely to eat, but to celebrate continuity, the old pagan festivals disguised as gatherings of loyalty. Toasts were offered to fallen comrades, to the ancestors, to the everlasting Germany. Even the music that played was chosen for its ancient tone, echoing medieval chants and folk rhythms. For those within, it was intoxicating. The world outside, its hunger, its politics, its chaos, seemed to vanish beyond the stone walls. Here, they were part of something eternal. Yet not all who came left unchanged for the better. Some began to dream strange dreams after staying in the castle, visions of fire and ice, of battles fought in distant ages. Others said they felt watched, as though unseen eyes followed them in the corridors. There were stories of footsteps echoing long after the rooms were empty, of candles that refused to go out. Perhaps it was the mind, steeped too long in darkness and repetition. Or perhaps it was something else, the echo of too much belief in too small a space. Himmler, ever the architect of ritual, encouraged such feelings. He wanted the castle to breathe myth. He had the genealogies of SS officers stored in its archives, tracing their bloodlines back centuries. He believed that through ritual and ancestry, he could awaken the ancient soul of the Germanic race. We are not merely men, he told his subordinates, we are the continuation of the ancient order. To doubt this was to doubt destiny itself. But destiny, as history shows, is a fragile thing. The deeper they sank into ceremony, the further they drifted from reality. Outside Weilsburg's gates, the world burned with economic crisis and propaganda. Inside, men knelt before candlelight, speaking to ghosts that answered only in silence. The contrast was striking, an empire of technology and tanks rooted in medieval dreams. And yet, there was beauty, twisted though it was. The solemn geometry of the halls, the shimmer of firelight on polished stone, the quiet devotion of men who truly believed, they gave the place a haunting majesty. Standing there, one could almost forget the horror that these same men would unleash upon the world. It was a beauty born of illusion, a stillness built upon fear. The castle seemed to feed on that illusion. It stood apart from time, its windows catching the last light of day and turning it to gold. When storms passed over the valley, lightning flashed against its towers like divine approval. The men who served there saw these signs and took them as proof that their work was sacred. They did not realize that they were prisoners of the story they themselves had written. Sometimes, late in the night, the crypt lay empty but for a few candles still burning low. Their wax pooled like white tears on the stone. The air was thick with the scent of smoke and metal. And if one listened closely, the wind that slipped through the narrow windows seemed to carry a whisper, not in words, but in feeling, a reminder that all rituals, no matter how grand, end in silence. By the time the world outside descended fully into war, Wilsberg had already become a monument to delusion. It was the heart of a faith without mercy, a sanctuary where imagination had turned to iron. The officers who once knelt before its black sun would march across Europe, carrying its shadow with them. And when the war was finally lost, the castle would stand as a relic of madness, its walls silent witnesses to how belief, once untethered from truth, can consume everything. For now, though, the candles still burn. The halls are still quiet. The rituals continue, night after night, in the castle that believes itself eternal. Outside, the rain falls gently over the valley, soft and steady, like a benediction that no one inside will ever hear. There is a peculiar restlessness that comes when a dream outgrows its walls. For the men who gathered in candlelit chambers and spoke of bloodlines and destiny, Germany itself began to feel too small, too ordinary. The rituals of Wilsberg, the runes on their rings, the whisper of ancient purity, all these things pointed to something beyond maps and politics. If their race was the heir of forgotten gods, then somewhere, they believed, proof of that inheritance still waited, carved in stone, sealed beneath mountains, sleeping under ice. Thus began a new chapter in their search for meaning, the quest for the ancient ones. In the mid-1930s, as Europe teetered between war and uneasy peace, Heinrich Himmler founded an organization whose name carried both mystery and menace, the Ahnenerbe, the Ancestral Heritage Research and Teaching Society. It was, on paper, a scholarly institution, meant to study archaeology, anthropology, and folklore. But behind the polite language of research lay a very different hunger, the desire to prove that Nazi myth was not myth at all, but history, that the Aryan race was not an idea, but a sacred lineage stretching back to the dawn of time. Himmler's scholars scoured the world for traces of this supposed origin. They dug in ancient graves, measured skulls, deciphered runes, and pored over medieval manuscripts. They studied everything from Norse sagas to Tibetan texts, searching for echoes of a lost homeland, a vanished civilization they called Thule or Hyperborea. And when books and bones no longer satisfied them, they turned their eyes to the mountains, where clouds touched the edge of myth itself. In 1938, an expedition was assembled under the banner of the SS. Its destination was as improbable as its purpose, the Himalayas. At its head stood Ernst Schaefer, a zoologist and explorer whose fascination with the natural world had drawn Himmler's attention. To the Reich, this was not merely a scientific venture, it was a pilgrimage. The men chosen to go were told they would walk upon the cradle of civilization, where the blood of the Aryans had once flowed pure and bright. As the expedition returned home in 1939, the world was changing again. The skies above Europe darkened with the threat of war. Yet in the halls of the SS, their findings were displayed like relics of revelation. Photographs of monasteries, ancient texts, and Tibetan masks adorned Wilsberg's walls. Himmler spoke to his officers of a sacred migration, a belief that the Aryans had once spread from a northern paradise, their wisdom diluted through centuries, waiting now to be reborn in the German soul. The men who had climbed the Himalayas listened, and perhaps they half believed. For there was something intoxicating about the scale of it all, to imagine oneself not as a mere mortal in uniform, but as the descendant of gods, the bearer of a cosmic torch. It gave meaning to the suffering, the struggle, the endless demands of loyalty. It wrapped conquest in poetry. But the mountains had told another story, one the SS could not hear, that the world is vast and diverse, and no single people own its mystery. The monks they photographed had no interest in race or destiny. The snow cared nothing for lineage. The sky stretched the same over every land. The men who returned from Tibet carried their measurements and artifacts, but not the peace that the mountains offered. They brought back only proof of their own restlessness, their need to believe that power could be sanctified by myth. In later years, when the Reich began to crumble, those photographs would resurface like ghosts from another dream. The faces of Tibetan monks would stare quietly from old archives, their expressions calm, their eyes unknowing of the empire that had once claimed them as kin. The relics, stripped of their imagined holiness, would gather dust in museums and basements, reminders of how easily wonder becomes weapon. And yet, in the hush of this story, there remains something deeply human in their folly. To climb mountains seeking gods, to wander far for meaning, these are ancient impulses. The tragedy lies not in the longing itself, but in the blindness that follows when men decide that the divine must look like them. The Nazis went to the Himalayas searching for their ancestors, and found only their reflection. As the wind howled through the passes, as prayer flags whipped against the thin air, the mountains gave them their answer in silence. But silence was not what they sought. They wanted certainty, proof, prophecy, something to fill the void left by reason. So they returned home triumphant, convinced that myth had spoken. And the world, already trembling on the edge of war, had one more illusion to bear.